Good morning, all of you. We are now live with Ingrid Srinath. Welcome to the Facebook Live session, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ingrid Srinath, let me briefly introduce you. She's the director at Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy, Ashoka University. She was also the ex-CEO of CRI and also a board member on many other organizations. And before I start, I'll explain a little bit about Living My Promise. Living My Promise is an initiative for ordinary Indians with a net worth of above 1 crore, where they come forward to pledge 50% or more of their wealth towards philanthropic causes, either in their lifetime or in their wills. So far, we have 41 people from across the country who have signed up to this initiative, and hopefully we'll hit few hundreds in the next year or so.
So 10 times as many as the Giving Pledge then?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So Giving Pledge stands at 200 people, I guess.
And in India, I think it's what, 4?
In India, 4, yeah. In India, it's 4, but globally they have 200 people who have signed up, but we are at 40 in less than a year.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So let me begin this Facebook Live session. Today, we'll be asking Ingrid Srinath a few questions. For viewers who are watching this, if you have any questions, please leave in the comment section. Ask your questions in the comment section on Living My Promise page. I will be happy to take those questions and post them to Ingrid Srinath. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for coming all the way and agreeing to do this Facebook Live session with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. The first question is here. What are some of the major gaps in philanthropy in India?
Well, arguably, everything has large areas that are underserved. So even if you take education, which is, as I keep joking, education is to philanthropy what cricket is to sports in India. Even if you take education, there's still obviously large areas that are underserved. So everything is underserved, but even within that, then relatively, if you look at anything to do with social justice, so whether that's caste or gender or ethnicity, anything to do with human rights, everything to do with climate, everything to do with the arts and culture, sports, there's the list, if you will, of things that are underfunded or underserved is very long. Disability, mental health, scientific research, the geographical region. So if you go to the Northeast or if you go to Kashmir or many other parts of the country. So there's a whole range of themes that are underserved. Most significantly, I want to say, are the areas of accountability, governance, transparency, the regulatory environment, and the ecosystem itself. So philanthropy and its ecosystem, or civil society and its ecosystem, may be the most underserved of all this long list of underserved areas. In some ways, the way to think about it is the further upstream you go, the lesser the funding. So if you're in a service delivery mode, which is you're actually administering anything from food to education to vaccines to other kinds of last mile services, that area is always likely to be better funded than the next upstream level, which is funding the institutional costs of doing that. And that is less likely to be, or even more likely to be funded than the upstream sector costs, so going to root causes as opposed to symptoms of those causes. And then the least funded will be when you go furthest upstream and look at the ecosystem of the sector as a whole. So institution, theme, sector, the further upstream you go on each of those, the less likely it is that you're going to see adequate funding.
Okay. We have a question from Amit Chandra. He's asking us, what can we do to make more, rich give a lot more?
So I think part of this is norms. I don't think we have well understood norms on what is an adequate amount of philanthropy for a wealthy person to do. I mean, in the West, you have everything from sort of religious norms that dictate something in the ballpark of 10% to something like a Giving Pledge, which talks about 50%, to people like Amit and Chuck Feeney and others who are giving significantly more than even the 50%. In India, we don't have that norm, and in part, I think it's up to philanthropists to set that norm, to say, to lead by example, if you will. So the more people we have doing the stuff that Amit is doing, and talking about it, not just doing it. I think we have a reluctance in India, particularly wealthy people have a reluctance to talk about their philanthropy, and we just need more of that if there's going to be that signaling effect. I think the second thing that we need to address if we're going to get wealthy people to give more is much better knowledge. So the fact that we don't have good data on any aspect of philanthropy, how much money is there, where is it going, where is it coming from, what is it accomplishing, all of that. And so we need, in a sense, some more progressive, if you will, philanthropists to invest in acquiring and disseminating that data. And finally, there's the whole issue of the narrative. So I think the narrative around civil society in particular, in recent years in particular, has become, this is an ineffective, inefficient, potentially corrupt, possibly anti-national sector. And framing a positive narrative around civil society that tells the truth about its size, about its impact, about its economic footprint, about the criticality of the services it delivers, and its role really in our society. So not just as a low-cost delivery mechanism, but also a watchdog, also an advocate, also an incubator of innovation is something that we need to do a much better job of. And we're looking really to philanthropy in some senses to make that happen. So philanthropists strengthening the ecosystem for philanthropy would go a long way in helping philanthropists give more together, I think, with peer pressure.
Yeah. For viewers watching this live session, I would request you to invite your friends and other people to join this session. As well as if you have any questions, please post them in the comment section on this below this live session. Thank you, ma'am. Why do you think these gaps exist? You have spoken about the upstream, the layers of things, but why do you think these gaps exist?
So I think part of it is just awareness. So if I talk about, let's say, an issue like internet governance, this is so new and so poorly understood that it isn't attracting a great deal of money. And there are other issues like that. The second one is the need for that emotional payoff. When I feed a child here and now, even if I don't see the child that I'm feeding, there is that instant warm, fuzzy feeling that I get. Funding, let's say CSIP at Ashoka, much less of a warm, fuzzy feeling. So the further upstream you go, in some ways, the less that emotional payoff is. The third one is trust. And so as a country, every institution we know has been discredited, whether that's politics or business or sports or Bollywood or you name it. And in some senses, that pervasive lack of trust then in institutions is something that affects giving more than anything else. Because I still have to pay my taxes, I still have to buy products from companies whose ethics I don't necessarily approve of, but I don't have to donate. And so building the lack of trust or the low levels of trust, I think, are another key barrier. And there's lots of stuff that we can do to address this. It's just a question of applying resources and building networks, I think, more than anything else. So the lack of voice in the sector for either philanthropy or civil society, and the two of them collectively, is something that again hurts the sector in terms of people not perceiving it as delivering the value that it does in fact deliver.
Yeah. Once again, for viewers watching, I would request you to ask any questions that you have for Ingrid Srinath in the comment section.
If I can talk just a little bit, Sushant, about risk.
Sure.
Since that's such a hot topic in some ways.
Yeah, please.
I think one of the things we're looking at CSIP is risk along two dimensions. Sort of a risk along the predictability of the outcomes.
Okay.
If I feed a child, in some senses, that's an entirely predictable outcome. The child is less hungry than it was a few hours previously. If I do something that's more focused around innovation, or if I do focus on something that is further upstream, the returns become less and less easy to measure and less easy to predict. So that's one kind of risk, predictability of outcomes. And the other risk, of course, is risk of consequences. So, will I suffer political consequences, or will there be some social consequences to my actions? And I think this notion of, I think if we understood risk better, and if we were more thoughtful about risk, and actually looked at our portfolio along these two dimensions, and said, where do my various grants or my various charitable activities sit along these two axes, we might come to more intelligent decisions about risk rather than simply going, oh no, that sounds too risky.
Okay. Yeah. We have another question from Harshvardhan. He's asking, how can we be assured that rich money is directly going to help grassroots organizations to create impact?
I think there are many different ways to do that. You can, everything from visiting projects yourself and seeing the outcomes in the flesh, so to speak. One methodology I don't think we use enough is constituency voice. So to actually just ask beneficiaries or ask clients, how is this changed your life? Rather than, and then of course there are all the other forms of audit and reporting that you can think of. So there's multiple ways of ensuring that your money does the good that it should and could do.
Yeah. So Amit Chandra has another question for you. He's asking, what are one or two things happening in Indian philanthropy in recent years that give you hope or make you excited?
So I think the first one is just the absolute growth. Even though we don't have good data on how much is growing or how fast it's growing, the sense is that there's a lot more people doing a lot more in more diverse areas. So that's one just innate good, if you will. And the other one is this willingness now of philanthropy to look at this multiplier effect. To say, if I fund the capacity building needs of an institution, or if I fund the institutional costs of investing in technology, investing in human resources, investing in my ability to raise money, that we're going to see a bigger multiplier than simply funding programs. So I think those two, more money from more people for more causes is one, and the willingness to invest in this multiplier effect may be the other.
That's interesting. We're very glad to know that more people are coming forward and giving. For viewers who have just joined, please post your questions to Ingrid Srinath in the comment section. I will be happy to take them up. Ingrid, there's another question. Why do you think individual philanthropists should consider funding these areas that you spoke of?
Well, for one, because of the multiplier that I just mentioned. So in terms of bang for your buck, the further upstream you go, the higher the returns are going to be, the higher the multiplier effect is going to be. So if I fund, for example, an organization's capacity to raise money, if I fund their fundraising, if you will, every rupee I put into that is going to multiply 10, 20, 100 times.
Yes.
As opposed to if I fund program, which is going to fund here and now and then not build any capacity to do more of the same. Yeah. And the same with the thematic issue. I think the idea that you could bring a network together, for example, as has just happened with climate, to say how can we do this intelligently by using our respective strengths rather than all of us reinventing the wheel. Or if you invest in building better knowledge, and so therefore people are not going to be reinventing each other's wheels, making the same mistakes, duplicating each other's efforts. So the further upstream you go, the greater the multiplier, and that's one reason to do it. The other is some of these areas, particularly I think when it comes to strengthening civil society, protecting democratic freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, these are just fundamental to our democracy. And I'm not convinced that it makes sense to be focusing on this child here and now as vital and as critical as the needs of that child here and now, if you're going to entirely ignore the society that this child is now going to grow up and be a citizen of. Yeah. So the need to look at what is absolutely non-negotiable for you. Is it ensuring that the planet is in a livable condition for these children, or is it just to ensure that these children can speak English and do math better than they do? I'm not suggesting that it's either or. Yeah. We need both, yes. And therefore we need philanthropy in a sense to diversify along that continuum and do the entire range of things.
Yeah. So, as a follow-up question, I think Venkat has a question for you. Should philanthropists start making decent-sized political donations?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think given that many of these philanthropists are already making those kinds of contributions in their capacity as individuals or as businesses, I'm not sure what philanthropy does would add to that. In fact, if you go by, for example, the example of the USA, where philanthropic contributions fund individual politicians' electoral campaigns and the public, what's it called, political action committees that then support the election efforts. I would argue that this has resulted in the elite actually having disproportionate policy influence. Somebody compared it to gods hurling thunderbolts at each other. So the average sort of public policy debate in the US is now, philanthropist versus philanthropist, and completely it leaves out the citizens that are actually directly affected by those policies. So I'm not convinced that political donations, contributions are any kind of answer to much better, I think, to fund advocacy efforts by nonprofits or social enterprises to make policy change happen, because that way you have some way of ensuring that those advocacy efforts are grounded in the needs of communities and the people that are most affected by those policies.
Yeah. For viewers joining us, please, if you have any questions for Ingrid Srinath, kindly post them in the comment section below. We have another question from Pushpa. She's asking how important is it for the rich to inspire others like them to give, and what are one or two ways you can suggest they could do about it?
I think this is where we started in some senses, which is the signaling effect of a donation. So we're seeing, for example, that when a philanthropist opens up a new area, if I look at Ashoka University as a case in point, right? Out of literally bucking any trend, here's a non-profit liberal arts university in Haryana funded by something close to 130 different individuals. The signaling effect that has, that this is something that these kinds of people think it's useful to do, is critical. And now you're going to see, half a dozen similar initiatives get sparked off across the country, as was the design and the intent when Ashoka was founded. Similarly with other areas, whether it's scientific research or mental health or arts and culture or sports, I think you're going to see just philanthropists making their contribution visible, I think has a huge and powerful effect. The other one is we do need a question around norms. We do need a discussion around norms. What is a good amount to give? In my view, I think, for example, if you're not giving till it hurts, till you're feeling some sacrifice, some sense that, well, perhaps there's this fantastic new handbag that you can no longer afford to buy, or perhaps you're going to take one fewer vacation a year. If you're not giving till it hurts, I think, so we need to have that discussion, a public discussion around what are the norms that we ought to follow. Having good data helps. So, in the US, for example, because it's such a well-known fact that the US gives 2% of GDP to philanthropy, in many ways that sets the norm then. The average is 2%. Do I want to be below average? Do I want to be above average? Do I want to help raise the average? So having to me, knowledge about this, norms around, and a narrative of what is possible. I think philanthropists perhaps don't speak enough about the benefits to them of this. Of how it has improved them as human beings, increased their levels of happiness, helped them sleep better at night. So really have those kinds of conversations, not just conversations around impact, which are critical, but really need more than that.
That's true. So we have another question from Mr. Pratyush. He's asking, how do you think can the gap between philanthropists and the organizations working in the so-called politically contentious issues like justice, human rights can be reduced?
I think it would help really for philanthropists to invest in convening around this issue. So, for example, we don't have, as most other countries might have, a human rights funders network or a edge philanthropy network, which is people who are saying what are those critical edgy issues that we should be looking at. I think we need those much better dialogue between the two sectors. I think we need much more storytelling. I mean, so, it seems like a huge and scary area. But there are ways to do this. So, for example, doing it collectively rather than doing it individually. I mean, a network doing this is somewhat insulated from the possible consequences. I think if philanthropy networks such as those that exist were to speak out about the value of these nonprofits and the work that they do, that would go a long way towards protecting themselves as well as the nonprofits who do that work.
Yeah, we are getting some questions from viewers. There's another question. Given your experience with CRY and now research at CSIP, can you speak a bit about the power of many small donors versus the focus on the set of small number of big rich who can write big checks? What is better for society and for NGOs?
Well, anyone who's ever heard me knows that I'm a huge fan of what we call retail philanthropy for multiple reasons. Retail philanthropy, first of all, is more resilient. So while in high net worth individuals or businesses are subject to business cycles, funding is subject to the political cycles. Individuals give, come hell or high water, and even in recession, even in bad times. So it's just a more reliable source of funding. It also provides you more autonomy because it comes with the fewest terms and conditions and the fewest strings attached. Thirdly, it in many ways that every rupee you raise from an individual does two things. It funds your organization, of course, but it also changes hearts and minds. So the fundraising from the public also changes public attitude. So it's kind of a double whammy when it comes to fundraising. And finally, it ensures that policy making, that the big issues of our time are not being left to a bunch of elites, but are actually being supported by the public at large.
Yeah.
So there's just, on any dimension I can think of, fundraising from the public is the better way to do this. There are some things the public will not fund. So, if I say, look, I need some money to experiment with some new technology that may or may not result in better outcomes, that's typically not something that the average retail philanthropist is willing to fund. They want to see their money go into more direct outcomes. And so I think that should be the preserve of big philanthropy, to provide the long-term, patient risk capital to build organizations and the sector rather than just programs.
Yeah. We have another question. What needs to be done to make grantors comfortable committing to blind pools which are sector aligned as against targeted giving, which is very specific program, initiative, or outcome?
So I mean, especially now with this talk around the social stock exchange, I think that there's real merit in considering this idea. Think of it perhaps as a mutual fund. So can we have a philanthropic mutual fund that tackles climate, one that maybe tackles education, one that, or even different aspects of education, one for human rights, one for child protection, one for gender, one for the Northeast. You could create a range of thematic mutual funds, exactly as you do in the financial services market. And essentially you're saying, I would then trust a fund manager or a group of fund managers to use their expertise to construct a portfolio of organizations and a portfolio of programs that collectively have far more impact than any one organization can have. So it seems to me this is an idea that's just waiting to happen. I'm hoping that the committee that's looking at the social stock exchange will consider it.
Yeah. I have another question for you. How can philanthropists know that their contributions in these areas will make a difference?
To some degree, the whole point of philanthropy is that it's not got certain outcomes. If the outcomes were entirely predictable, then there's a good chance that they would be funded either by the state or the market. The reason you need philanthropy is to fund, as I said, patient risk capital. And so to say, I will only fund that which has entirely predictable, entirely certain outcomes, in some senses is to negate the very reason for philanthropy. But there are, as I said, multiple ways. We can look at everything from audits to blockchain as a way to ensure that money is going where it said it would go. But I think one of the powerful mechanisms, and I mentioned this earlier, that we neglect in terms of ensuring our money is achieving the outcomes that we seek, is to ask the people who that money is meant to, whose lives the money is meant to impact, and say, what difference has this made in your life? Okay. So, I mean, even at the level of CSIP, so it's hard to measure almost anything that we do, but it's not hard to ask people who participate in a program at CSIP, how did this change your way of working, your organization, the outcomes you're organizing? So I think we don't do enough of what we might call constituency voice.
Okay, nice. For viewers watching, if you have any questions, please post in the comment section. How do philanthropists decide on who is the right partner or the right program to support?
So sadly, in the absence of good data, we're dependent in many ways on social networks and word of mouth. So we're rapidly approaching a situation where there's a club of people that have entry, to which some NGOs have entry, and to which the vast majority of NGOs do not.
Yes.
So if this famous philanthropist gave you money, then there's a good chance you're going to be able to get money from all his or her friends, or neighbors, relatives, and associates. Whereas if you're a new startup organization or an organization that works in a part of the country that is more remote, or an organization that works in a thematic area, I just was talking to somebody that works on the death penalty and other issues and the conditions in our jails. This is not by any stretch of imagination a popular issue. Very, very few Indians want to support a review even of does the death penalty work, or what are the conditions under which people that have been convicted what are their demographics and how do they end up there. So the risk at the moment is in the absence of knowledge, in the absence of good ways to compile reporting. So you have a GuideStar India, for example, that gives you the financial data for many of these. But in the absence of other forms of information exchange platforms, and in the absence of adequate media coverage, because this is the other problem we're dealing with. The sector has literally fallen off the radar of the mainstream media. So if I was to take IVR out of the mix and Better India out of the mix, and a few others, Youth Yavas and others, that essentially the sector gets practically no coverage. So to invest in media outreach, to invest in the sector's own media vehicles, all of that I think is going to be critical to being able as a philanthropist to make better decisions. I mean, I live in, my dream is that someday we will have the sort of data. I remember seeing this demo once, which allowed you to drill down and say, who else is funding HIV/AIDS programs in Florida among African American communities? That level of granularity. For us, I mean, I would have a hard time even sitting at CSIP to say who all are funding malnutrition or funding the efforts against malnutrition. So better data and better networks, more transparency is, even from philanthropists. I mean, philanthropy, and I may be going out on a limb here and annoying many philanthropist friends, is now the last bastion of opacity in reporting. Every other sector is required to report its activities at some level. Philanthropy, nothing. And so we have no way of knowing what other philanthropists are doing, or what the effects of those are, or what they're learning in those processes, because of the absolute lack of transparency when it comes to philanthropy.
Yeah. We have another question. How can philanthropy materially improve things that the state is responsible for? Can you give us a good example you have come across?
So the risk when you do stuff that is public service delivery is that you will crowd out the state rather than crowd it in. And I think that's sort of a good lens to think about when you're doing public-private partnership of any kind. My favorite example, of course, of crowding government in is Childline India. Here's a thing that started as a professor at TIS concerned about children that were living rough on the streets of Mumbai, and comes up with this idea of doing a helpline. But very quickly it gets adopted by the union government, becomes a government program 100% funded by the government. It's written into the legislation, so whether it's juvenile justice or the ICPS, the Indian Child Protection Scheme, or POCSO, or the child labor laws and so on, Childline is literally embedded in those legislations. And so it doesn't even matter which political party is in power up to a point. Its long-term sustainability is ensured. And they have a nice balance of public funding and private funding. The private funding going to do what the government funding will not do, which is invest in technology, invest in innovation, invest in brand building, invest in training, doing those kinds of things. So you now have a network that covers, when I last checked, something like 540 districts in the country that serves the needs of every child in distress. But that sits there like a thin layer between the child and the services that the child is entitled to. It does not replicate those services. What it does is ensure that that system works. So ensure that everyone from railway police to juvenile police, child welfare committees, all of these things that are supposed to respond to children in distress actually do respond. That's my favorite example. Thanks very much for that question.
We have another question from Venkat, he's asking, how can one invest in mainstream media to improve visibility of the sector? Example, fellowships or travel.
Both of those are excellent ideas, but I think we just need to invest in outreach to the sector. So many more of us need to be on social media, because that's where journalists are now discovering stories. We need to do capacity building for journalists who are interested, to whether that is, in my experience, whenever we've offered a journalist the chance to, for example, travel to a program where interesting work is happening, they've seldom said no. Journalists love good stories. This is what their trade is. So as long as you can make the story interesting, they'll do it. What we're suffering from right now is the cutbacks in mainstream media on any issues that are sort of not the news of the day. And so, the ability for a news organization to spare a whole person several days to do a story is something that we're just lacking. And so we probably need to invest in, as Venkat suggests, the fellowships and the grants that will fund that kind of thing. If you look again at other countries that are doing this, the growth in non-profit media, so even the Washington Post is now effectively philanthropically funded, or Politico, or other kinds of non-profit structured media houses may be the way of the future, because though in India we're not yet at the point where media cannot raise resources through subscriptions and advertising, it certainly means that we're losing the coverage of these issues.
Yeah, I have another question for you. The last few questions that we'll be taking. While that LivingMyPromise signatories, promise to donate 50% of their wealth, of their net worth in their lifetime or in their wills. But in general, for the middle and upper middle class, what do you think is a good percentage of their income or wealth to donate?
This goes back to the question of norms, and I think it's a public conversation we need to have. As I said, in some countries, like the US, for example, we know what the average is, and therefore people can then peg themselves to that average. In some religious communities, the religion specifies the norm. So it may be tithing or zakat or whichever your particular religious norm is. But for secular giving, in a sense, we don't have a norm. And the only norm I can advise in the absence of that norm is what I said earlier, which is to such time as this is not costing you something, that you're not feeling the pain, if you will, you're really not giving enough.
Yeah, so give until it hurts. Yeah, and there is a trust deficit and belief that donations to non-profits are misused, or ineffective in delivering the desired outcomes. What are your comments on this?
So I think this is one of the great myths of our time. I've worked in the sector now for 22 years. I've seldom come across any instances of fraud, and where there have been instances of fraud, they've typically been so minor that you wouldn't even. We haven't had the sort of non-profit scams and scandals that you had in the for-profit sector. So if you make any comparison to business or politics or media or sports or any other sector, then the non-profit sector is by far more trustworthy and by far seems to at least display much higher levels of integrity. So that's on the sort of corruption front. On the effectiveness front as well, one of the metrics I like to think about is there's this great quest in India for us not just being a back office to the world, but actually producing brands and products that the world will emulate. The non-profit sector has been doing this for decades. I mean, I can think of a dozen non-profit brands that are from India, that are well known around the world, that have been replicated around the world. If I just go back to Childline, I mean, Childline India is a model that's been, I think, replicated in something like 54 countries around the world. I don't see a for-profit equivalent of that. And so I think, but these facts are almost unknown. I mean, we almost keep them like a secret to ourselves. So we really do need to do a better job of telling these stories, doing more contemporary, more case studies of this kind, not just case studies around scale and sustainability, but case studies around innovation, about being incubators of innovation. Every significant government policy you can think about that has benefited huge numbers of people was incubated in the social sector. Whether that was RTI or whether that was Narega, or you name a policy that has had sweeping national impact on hundreds of millions of people, and the innovation was incubated in the non-profit sector. But that's not how it's been told as a story, and more importantly, that's not where the funding is going. The funding is going to replicating what we know already works, rather than in incubating innovation.
I think media needs to step up and
And we need to step up and tell our stories much better, and then allocate more of our time and resources to telling those stories.
So I'll take one last question. So should there be a coordination body for CSR and private philanthropy?
Yes, is the short answer.
Okay. So like one more question from Ashok Tyagi. With private funding being 5% of total social sector funding, spending, and public funds making up the rest, is there really any merit in utilizing this block of funds for funding mainstream programs where the government already spends or has budgets? Wouldn't it be better to use this pool as only a catalytic source, maybe for performance guarantee or capacity build, niche programs, pilot projects, innovations only?
Again, absolutely, yes. I mean, it makes no sense at all for the 70,000 crores to be trying to accomplish what you need 700,000 crores to do it, which I'm hoping that the finance minister will deliver a few hours from now. Beyond that, however, I think the other thing to be thinking about on that front is not just what catalytic role you can play, but the fact that you need. Look at the SDGs. I mean, I don't know what the current funding gap is in India, but we're looking at trillions of rupees, really. We're not going to accomplish those goals as a nation if we continue to do business as usual. We're going to have to think about bigger multipliers, new sources of funding, new ways of funding, if we're going to unlock the potential to achieve the SDGs. And if India doesn't achieve the SDGs, the world doesn't achieve the SDGs, because all the big gaps are really in India on most of the SDGs. So we're going to let the world down, and we're going to, more importantly, let our own people down if we fail to do things differently. And we need an urgent conversation about this. That is not just each of us, doing what we can. We really need to figure out how we can collectively do this much, much better.
Oh, I'll just take one more question. Volunteering is another big part, which is not explored much. What are your thoughts on volunteering in government, PSU, and corporates? What should we do to scale it? What are your ideas on this?
I mean, certainly we're seeing at Ashoka University, for example, huge amounts of benefit to both the recipient of the volunteering as well as the provider of the volunteering, which in our case is mainly students. So if I look at the Young India Fellowship and their experiential learning program, I've seen groups do amazing work with political parties, with government departments, with corporates, with non-profits, and so there's a huge untapped pool of talent just waiting to be discovered or to find its application. We're not doing a great job of, again, brokering that interface. I mean, I volunteer and others are, Bhumi and others are trying to do this, but we need a much, much more comprehensive gateway or portal where people can discover the volunteers they need and volunteers can discover the opportunities they need.
That's true. That's true. I think it was a fantastic session. Like Amit Chandra is saying that this is one of it. This one is a real gem session. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming all the way and doing this Facebook Live session for our audience. Next week we will have another philanthropist or speaker talking on Living My Promise. So every Saturday we will be conducting Facebook Live sessions. Please be here. If you have any questions, thank you. We've taken up as many questions as possible. And like I said, if you're interested in Living My Promise, if you want to pledge 50% of your wealth for philanthropic causes, either in your lifetime or in your wills, or in general, you should all try and give it until it hurts. And thank you so much. You can log into livingmypromise.org to see who the people are, and if you're interested, join the cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you
much. Thank you.